The day had started like any other. The sun shone brightly over the dense forests of the American Midwest, casting long shadows through the trees. It was the perfect day for a hike, quiet, peaceful, and calm. The human protagonist, a solitary man in his early 30s, was deep in the woods, enjoying the serenity of nature. His name was Mark, and he often came out here to escape the noise of the world. He had no idea that today would be different, that today would change everything. Suddenly, a loud crash shattered the silence. The sound was like nothing he had ever heard before, deep, rumbling, and sharp, almost as if the very ground had split open. Mark froze, his heart racing. It wasn't a normal sound, and it didn't come from any natural source. His first thought was of a plane crash, but it sounded otherworldly. Without wasting a moment, he darted in the direction of the noise, adrenaline coursing through his veins. As Mark reached the clearing, he stopped dead in his tracks. There, amidst the smoke and charred trees, was a ship that was not from Earth. It was sleek, metallic, with strange glowing lights pulsing along its hull. It lay half-crushed, the remains of some kind of explosion scattered around it. Mark's mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing, but there was no time for questions. A figure moved within the wreckage, stumbling toward the dense forest nearby. The figure was humanoid, but not like anything Mark had ever seen. She was tall, with glowing blue skin and sharp, angular features. Her long silver hair flowed behind her like a waterfall, shimmering in the sunlight. Her eyes, bright and unnaturally large, flickered with confusion and fear. She was a girl, no older than 20, but she looked as if she had just walked out of a nightmare. She was clearly injured. Her arm was bleeding, and she seemed unsteady, as if the crash had left her weakened. Mark hesitated for a moment, his mind racing. Should he approach her? Could she be dangerous? After all, he had heard strange rumors about alien encounters, but nothing like this. Yet, something in his gut told him she wasn't a threat. She looked terrified, lost, and hurt. Whatever she was, she needed help. With his heart pounding, Mark slowly moved forward, making his presence known by pushing aside a few branches. The girl immediately tensed, her eyes locking onto him. She was clearly afraid, but there was something else in her gaze, a mixture of hope and uncertainty. She didn't know whether to run or to trust him. Mark took a careful step forward, trying to ease her fears. "It's okay," Mark said softly, trying to sound calm and reassuring. His words were barely more than a whisper, knowing that any sudden movement might frighten her more. The girl took a hesitant step back, her hand raised in warning. She didn't understand his words, but the tone seemed familiar. She opened her mouth to speak, but only a string of incomprehensible syllables came out, a language Mark couldn't begin to understand. Mark stopped in his tracks, realizing the gravity of the situation. She wasn't from here, she wasn't human. The alien girl struggled, trying to communicate, but her words were lost in translation. Mark could feel the tension in the air, as though 1,000 questions hung between them, unanswered. He was staring into the eyes of something not of this world, and the weight of it sent a chill down his spine. But Mark wasn't the type to turn away from someone in need. The girl's injuries were obvious, and he couldn't just leave her here, alone and vulnerable. Without thinking too much about it, he knelt beside her, gently placing his hands on her arm. She flinched at first, clearly not used to human touch. But as he carefully began to tend to her wounds, she seemed to relax, just a little. Mark ripped a strip of fabric from his shirt to create a makeshift bandage, all the while trying to stay calm and focused. The girl's eyes followed his every move, wary but curious. She was quiet now, watching him, still unsure of what to make of him or his intentions. Mark could sense the vulnerability in her, but there was also something strong about her, an inner strength that told him she had been through far more than a simple crash. Despite the language barrier, there was something strangely intimate about the moment. She was so different from him, so alien, yet they shared this fleeting connection, a moment where both of them were uncertain and scared, yet unwilling to give up. He continued to work on her arm, careful not to hurt her more, as she watched him in silence. Finally, when he was done, he took a step back, his hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline. The girl didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Her gaze softened, her eyes filled with something he couldn't quite place, something between gratitude and fear. Mark offered her a smile, though he wasn't sure if she understood. The air between them was thick with the unknown, but in that moment, one thing was clear. Their fates were now linked. "Stay with me," Mark said, more to himself than to her. He didn't know what the future held, but for now, this strange alien girl was no longer alone, and neither was he. As the days passed, the bond between Mark and the alien girl grew. At first, the girl had been wary and distant, unsure if she could trust him. But Mark was patient. He understood her fear, her confusion, and her vulnerability. Slowly, the alien girl began to relax in his presence. Mark provided her with food, and though she didn't fully understand the taste, she accepted it with gratitude. They ate together, sitting by a small fire, the crackling warmth between them making their connection feel less strange. The girl began to understand Mark's gestures, how he pointed to things, mimed actions, and used simple words. Her grasp of his language grew, and they communicated with a mix of broken words, signs, and the quiet understanding that only time could create. She could not speak much, but her eyes spoke volumes. As the days turned into weeks, Mark became more fascinated by her. The alien girl wasn't just mysterious in appearance. She had abilities that seemed impossible. Mark had witnessed her healing herself from a deep wound, something he had never seen a human do. She also displayed an uncanny ability to move objects with just her mind. At first, Mark was cautious, unsure of what these powers meant, but they didn't scare him. Instead, they intrigued him. He wanted to learn more about her world, but most of all, he wanted to protect her. But just as their bond was growing stronger, a new danger emerged. One evening, while they were resting in their makeshift camp, a strange noise echoed through the trees. It was low and mechanical, like something heavy moving through the forest. Mark stood up, his senses alert, and the girl tensed beside him. The air grew thick with tension as a group of alien hunters appeared in the clearing. They were tall, armored, and ruthless, their eyes cold with purpose. They spoke in a language the girl didn't recognize, but she understood their intent. They were here for her, and they believed humans were a threat. Mark's heart raced as the hunters scanned the area, their weapons ready. The alien girl looked at Mark, her eyes filled with fear. She knew what was at stake. If they caught her, they would kill him and anyone else who stood in their way. But there was more than just fear in her gaze. There was a struggle, a battle within her. Her loyalty to her people clashed with the love she had begun to feel for Mark. The girl's heart was torn between two worlds. She had never felt this kind of affection before. The human had cared for her, helped her heal, and shown her kindness. But her people would never understand her growing attachment to him. They saw humans as nothing more than an inferior species. Could she abandon them? Could she choose a life with him instead of her own kind? Mark looked at her, his eyes full of silent understanding. He knew the weight of her decision. Whatever choice she made, they would be forever changed. As the alien hunters closed in on Mark and the girl, a sense of unease filled the air. Mark had no doubt anymore. This girl was not from Earth. Her strange appearance, the powers she displayed, and the mysterious ship she had arrived in all confirmed it. But what troubled him most was the fact that these hunters were here for her. He knew that if she returned to her people, it would only bring danger to them both. Mark glanced at her, his heart heavy with the weight of the situation. He could see the fear in her eyes, but he also saw something else. A determination, a need to protect. He wasn't sure how much longer they could hide, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let her go back to them. No matter the consequences, he had to keep her safe. She had trusted him, and he couldn't betray that trust. The hunters were getting closer. Mark could hear their mechanical footsteps crunching through the forest, their voices harsh and demanding. The girl's eyes widened as she felt their presence. The time to run was over. Suddenly, the quiet of the night was shattered by the deafening sound of gunfire. The hunters had arrived, and they weren't here for peace. They stormed through the trees, firing their weapons and creating chaos in their wake. Mark barely had time to react as the first blast hit the ground nearby, throwing him off balance. The alien girl immediately sprang into action. With a fierce look in her eyes, she raised her hand, and Mark watched in awe as she sent a shock wave of energy toward the hunters. The blast was so powerful that it sent several of them flying backward, their armor dented from the force. She moved like lightning, her telekinetic powers tearing through the trees and throwing objects at the hunters with incredible precision. Mark had never seen anything like this before. He had always been a peaceful man, not one for combat. But as the hunters continued to advance, he realized that he couldn't just stand by. The girl was fighting for her life, and he needed to help. He grabbed a nearby stick, using it as a weapon, and ran toward the hunters with as much courage as he could muster. The battle was fierce. Mark dodged and struck at the hunters, doing his best to hold them off, but he was outmatched. The alien girl was a force to be reckoned with, but Mark was just a man, trying to protect her. During the fight, Mark was caught off guard. One of the hunters got too close, and a blast hit him in the shoulder, sending him crashing to the ground. The pain was immediate, and for a moment, everything went black. But then he felt something cool and soothing touch his wound. It was the alien girl, kneeling beside him. Her hands glowed softly as she used her healing powers to mend the injury. The pain began to fade, replaced by a warmth that spread through his body. She was saving him, just as he had saved her. In that moment, Mark realized how deep their connection had grown. As she healed him, he could feel her emotions, her fear, and her hope. They were no longer two strangers thrown together by chance. They were a team, bound by the fight for survival. The girl had become more than just an alien to him. She had become someone he cared about deeply. Their bond had strengthened, and as they looked around at the chaos unfolding around them, Mark knew they would face whatever came next. Together. Amid the chaos of battle, just as the hunters began to regroup, a familiar voice echoed through the clearing. The alien girl froze. She recognized that voice. It was the voice of someone she once trusted. The face that appeared from the shadows was unmistakable. A former ally, a member of her own kind. Her heart sank as she realized the betrayal. The betrayer was one of the hunters who had once been close to her. They had fought together, shared moments of camaraderie. She had once believed in his loyalty, in his cause. But now he stood before her, cold and indifferent, his weapons drawn. "You should have known this day would come," he said, his tone flat and calculated. "You must return to your people for the good of your race. If you don't, I will destroy him, this human who means so much to you. He is nothing more than a tool in your weakness." The girl's heart shattered. The betrayal was unbearable. She had never imagined that someone she had trusted could turn on her so easily. He wasn't just threatening her life now, he was threatening Mark's as well. The girl glanced at Mark, who was still recovering from his injury, and then back at the betrayer. The pain of the moment was overwhelming, but there was also something else. A realization. The man she had grown so close to, the one who had shown her love and kindness, was now at risk because of her. The weight of her people's expectations clashed with the love she had for Mark. Could she truly return to her people and leave him behind? Or could she defy everything she knew to protect the one person who had cared for her in a way her own kind never had? Tears welled up in her eyes as she turned away from the betrayer. The struggle was too much, too painful to bear. She felt the pull of her heritage, of her loyalty to her people, but she also felt the pull of something stronger, her humanity. "No," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. "I will not go back." With that, the girl made her decision. She couldn't let Mark die. The girl turned to him, her eyes filled with determination. "We have to leave. Now." In a desperate act, she grabbed Mark's hand and pulled him toward the dense woods. The alien hunters would not give up easily, but neither would they. She could hear the betrayer's voice calling out behind them, demanding she return, but she didn't look back. This was the only chance they had. The girl led Mark deep into the wilderness, away from the hunters, away from everything that had once been her world. As they ran, she made a silent vow to herself. She would protect him. She would find a way for them to survive together, far from the conflict and betrayal of her people. No matter what it took, they would build a new life on Earth, together. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the wilderness as the girl and Mark pushed forward, running for their lives. The hunters were closing in fast, their footsteps heavy on the ground as they tracked their prey. The final confrontation was inevitable. But the girl, though exhausted and on the verge of collapse, had one last surprise in store. As they reached a clearing, the girl stopped suddenly, her senses heightened. Mark, breathless and struggling to keep up, looked at her in confusion. "What is it?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. "I can feel them," she said softly, her eyes narrowing as she looked into the distance. "They're close." Before Mark could respond, the ground trembled beneath their feet. The hunters had found them, and they were ready for a fight. The girl turned to Mark, her face determined. "Stay behind me," she ordered, her voice firm. She closed her eyes, and the air around them seemed to crackle with energy. In an instant, her telekinetic powers surged to life. She lifted her arms, and the trees around them creaked and groaned as they were ripped from their roots. The girl sent the trees flying at the hunters with incredible force, knocking them off balance. Her power was overwhelming, more than anything Mark had ever imagined. But the hunters weren't done yet. They regrouped, charging at her with weapons drawn. Mark watched in awe as the girl fought back with a fury he had never seen before. Her powers were like nothing he had ever witnessed. She was no longer the fragile, confused alien he had first met. She was a force to be reckoned with. Mark, though inexperienced in combat, couldn't just stand by. He grabbed a fallen branch and fought alongside her, using his newfound courage to protect the girl he had come to love. Together, they were unstoppable. The hunters were no match for their combined strength and determination. One by one, the hunters fell, their attempts to capture them failing miserably. The girl's power was too great, and Mark's resolve too strong. When the last of the hunters finally lay defeated, the clearing fell silent. The battle was over. Exhausted but triumphant, the girl turned to Mark. Their eyes met, and for the first time they both saw the depth of their feelings. There was no more hiding, no more running. The girl had made her choice. She would stay on Earth with him. "I don't belong with them anymore," she whispered, her voice filled with conviction. "This is my home now, with you." Mark smiled, his heart swelling with love. He had never imagined his life would turn out this way. The girl, the alien, had become more than just a stranger to him. She had become his everything. He pulled her into an embrace, feeling the warmth of their connection. "Then we'll build a new life here, together." The two of them stood together in the clearing, looking out at the world they had fought so hard to protect. Despite the battles, the dangers, and the betrayals, they had found something worth fighting for, each other. As the stars began to appear in the sky, they walked hand in hand, ready to start their new life. There was a sense of peace in the air now. The girl no longer felt like an outsider, and Mark knew, without a doubt, that their love was real. It was powerful. They had faced the impossible and come out victorious. Together, they could face whatever the future held.